So welcome everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to SUPNA South Asian Climate Solidarity's first ever event and report launch. A report which we hope will kick off a conversation about climate justice and also introduce our group to all of you, to the world. Thank you so much for joining. It really means a lot to us to have so many people on the call. So thank you. My name is Jess Harwood. I am the co-founder of SUPNA with Ruchira. I also work at the Sunrise Project on the Australian coal mining team, and I'm a comic artist. Before we jump in, we need to make some acknowledgements. So before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that wherever we're calling in from in Australia, we are calling in on unceded Aboriginal land, and we pay our respects to traditional owners past, present, and emerging. I'm calling in from the land of the Bidjigal, Bira, Birigal, and Gadigal people today in beautiful Bronte, where I'm staying for a little while. I would really love to encourage everyone to introduce themselves in the chat, put your pronouns in there and tell us what land you are calling in from. And while you're doing that, we would also like to acknowledge the ongoing fights for justice, sovereignty, and land rights, particularly against fossil fuel expansion, not only by traditional owners in Australia, but also across South Asia on Adivasi land. And we didn't plan it this way, but we are releasing this report just days after Diwali. So we would like to wish you a happy Diwali, happy Bandi Chor Divas, and happy Kali Puja for all those celebrating. So before we talk about this report, which we're launching today, written by Dr. Ruchira Tulukdar and interviewing many of the young South Asian activists, Australian activists that we have on the call, I'd like to tell you a little story about SUPNA South Asian Climate Solidarity, as maybe you're wondering what we are, who we are, what we do. So if you can cast your mind back to 2020, in 2019, there'd been catastrophic bushfires and school strikes were really rocking the activist scene in Australia. And it became clear that there were a large number of activists, many young activists in particular, with South Asian heritage, who were suddenly very visible in the movement. And that was when Ruchira and I had connected up for the first time. So we called a Zoom meeting and we asked everyone we knew of South Asian heritage in the movement to jump on. And honestly, what happened for the next hour was a bit like kind of group therapy. Someone would say, I really want to go to the school strikes, but my parents are really worried about my safety at the protests. And, lots of us would say, yeah, me too. I had that exact experience. And then someone else would say, in Australia, they talk a lot about the climate impacts in the future. But my family at home in Bangladesh have been struggling with climate impacts like floods for years and years. And we were like, yeah, we've noticed that too. So maybe we should have foreseen that there would be these commonalities in cultural differences with the rest of the climate movement. But we didn't actually realize how stark they would be. And we all really bonded over this back then. And since then, we've all been on a journey, either individually and also as a group, to understand our identities, how we fit in and show up in the climate movement, how we make space for ourselves. And we've also all been on a journey to understand our privilege as South Asian migrants or children of migrants in Australia, and what that means in being climate advocates in a global context. For example, foregrounding climate impacts across South Asia in a country which is a leading exporter of coal. So SUPNA means dream in many South Asian languages. So we're a collective in the South Asian diaspora. We are activists, professionals, academics, artists, students, campaigners, and we focus on climate justice. We're not only about diversifying the climate movement and providing a group for people of South Asian heritage to be part of and to support their inclusion in the broader climate movement, but critically, we are also focused on climate justice and creating links with communities and activists in South Asia. This second bit, we have not had a lot of capacity to do currently, but we want to build our capacity to that going forward. So for now, we are run largely by a small group of people who you can see on the call today with Sapna logo in their background. You can all see that we're a small but we're growing group. And that's a bit about Sapna. So I will now pass to co-founder of Sapna, Dr. Ruchira Talukder, who has researched and written this report. Over to you, Ruchira.
So this is the report that we are launching today. It's taken a whole year in the making from the time of the interviews last November, nearly a year, till today that we're releasing it. And the illustration on the cover is by Jessica Harwood, much loved illustrator. We kind of know her work. Next slide. I just want to set a little bit of context around the report. So in 2012, I did a set of 12 interviews with South Asian youth studying at university. I was interested to understand what my community thought about climate activism. I was one myself, and I couldn't find anyone to interview in the climate movement who was South Asian. So I spoke to students who identified as concerned about climate change. They spoke about not wanting to participate in a climate movement which was framed around values of white society because those values did not resonate with them. And they thought their white peers did not understand the global South and its dynamics and those various contexts. What's happened since then? In the last 10 years, multiculturalism and particularly Asian migrations, particularly South Asian migrations, have significantly increased, and that's changed the face of Australian society. But broadly speaking, we can admit that the climate movement does not reflect the diversity of Australian society. What's also happened is because of the emergence of youth climate movements, School Strikes for Climate Change, before that Australian Youth Climate Coalition, there's SEED and there's Specific Climate Warriors, which are specific BIPOC climate activist groups. Youth climate activism has actually led to the participation in a lot of people of color, youth activists, migrant, second generation youth activists in the climate movement, changing the face of the climate movement to a certain extent. So what happens, what emerges when we interview youth activists today who are actually participating in the movement? What are they going to say about the values, the framings, the idea of justice, and also the narratives of climate justice that they want to talk about? That was the purpose for this report and the set of interviews I did in 2021. Next slide. South Asia, interestingly, it kind of concentrates or epitomizes this changing context in Australia, the changing social context. We have seen the last census data, and India is now the third largest country of birth of people living in Australia. At the same time, like a lot of migrations recent to Australia, people coming from South Asia, coming from an extremely climate impacted place, bringing those perspectives with them. And at the same time, there is a highly influential and growing South Asian diaspora who are there and who can be mobilized and spoken to. Next slide. So against this context, this is an illustration based on climate impacts in South Asia that we produced for Sapna a little while ago. So next slide. So there is, given the new geopolitical shift in Australia's relationships with South Asia, with India, there is perhaps a greater need to think about creating solidarities and creating movement alliances across these two places, where communities and networks are across the justice imperatives on both sides, even when governments might drive a fossil fuel or big energy kind of agenda. So next slide. So this brings us to the report, for which I interviewed 12 South Asian youth activists. All names have been changed in the profiles for the reasons of privacy, as per privacy guidelines of the research. They come from different walks of life, and they come from different parts of South Asia, different countries. They also live in different parts of Australia, but there are certain commonalities in terms of their responses. Next slide. So this report, titled Why North-South Intersectionality Matters for Climate Justice, it traces the responses that I got from the respondents through 3 storylines. Why a storyline? Because a story gives a fuller social and cultural context, makes for interesting reading, and perhaps better understanding. So the first story is around why they joined climate activism and what is their idea of climate justice. And this is very much what came out of the interviews is very much similar to what came out of the 2012 interviews in terms of their identities, where they come from, also where they live, shaping their values and their idea of justice. The second set of stories is actually about them negotiating the climate movement space, which is predominantly white space, and their challenges in it, but also the changes they might have been able to bring. And the third is about how they negotiate their activism with their families. The families having a strong migrant imperative, wanting the best for their children, for them to study and take up full-blown careers rather than being an activist. So they make for different sets of stories which are interconnected. So in the first set of stories, looking at why they come to climate activism, it's very evident that where they come from and where they live and their sense of identity in an Australian multicultural society is very strongly behind what they think climate justice should be. So some of the strongest responses actually come from places where their families have seen climate impacts firsthand, and those are stories they want to tell, along with their own understanding of climate impacts in the places they now live in. For example, connecting rural Bangladesh and Western Sydney, which is a climate hotspot, an extreme heat hotspot. Next slide. So in terms of the second set of stories about the kinds of challenges they face in the climate movement, it's what comes out in terms of the responses is that the challenges are systemic. It's not necessarily the kind of challenge that you face as a POC in terms of representation in the media, or not necessarily just not being able to tell intergenerational stories of climate impacts from South Asia. It is a systemic kind of challenge where a lot of them and the schools they go to, the places they come from, and the kinds of stories they want to say are marginalized in the movement. So it's an intersecting set of reasons. And here are some of the quotes. You can read them in details in the report, through which they find multiple intersecting challenges because of which they're not able to participate in the movement fully. And there's a constant comparison between them and their white peers, because it is a very performative space. And when you miss out on opportunities, you do think about what are your challenges versus what are their benefits and advantages that they can perform better. So some of the strongest responses actually come from reflections of how their place matters and how their white peers think those places do not matter. So this quote comes from the context of a meeting in which it was said that Western Sydney should not be prioritized as a climate hotspot and not be talked about. It's just not about a place, it is about the people who live there, and it's also about where those people come from. So this quote is telling, it is multi-layered, and it talks about how young migrant POCs in the climate movement might perceive the marginalization that their white peers completely unintentionally might be subjecting them to. Next slide. So what happens is in the set of interviews that I did with 12 respondents, some of them actually left school strikes or the youth climate movement because they were disheartened, but some stayed on. Some actually stayed on to kind of be part of a change that was brought in as well. So the responses and the journeys have been mixed, but overall there was a sense of burnout from the intersecting systemic challenges that they had to face. Next slide. So finally, coming to recommendations, looking at the responses and looking at the kinds of leadership impulses that the respondents already bring into activism. Some of the strong things that come out in the analysis and in the recommendations is that stories of lived experiences of climate change that the persons of color, migrants bring to Australia should be included in the climate narrative, and they should be included in the climate narrative. Connecting places in the global south, such as in South Asia, and in the global north, such as Western Sydney, which is a climate hotspot too, can create that powerful narrative across places and also bring a global sense of climate justice. And finally, including stories of people and communities facing intersectional vulnerabilities. That's also something that the youth activists tried to foreground, and that's more and more going to be critical, as one of the respondents say, that to counter xenophobia, to actually make the movement be compassionate, we need to be able to tie up and have solidarities with refugees and various other points like that. Next slide. So what to take away from the report is, of course, read it and share it and discuss in your organization about what you might do as a next step, and organize a catch up with us at Sapna to talk about it. For other POC groups participating today, we'd love to collaborate with you and talk about next steps in bringing intergenerational, multi-place climate narratives out in the movement. And there is a kind of brown bag lunch next Thursday, where we're going to talk a bit more about North-South intersectionality and why that matters in climate activism. So do come to it. So that's the end of the report presentation. I'm going to, before we pass on to responses for the report, I want to acknowledge the support I've received from particularly two research communities for this. One is the Earth Unbound Collective at Deakin. Thank you for your support, and especially Dr. Eve Mays, who's here today. And thank you for the generous peer review. The other cluster of support I've had is from Dr. Sukhmani Khurana, who is also here today, I hope, and her research center, Young and Resilient Research Center at University of Western Sydney. I'm now actually going to ask Sukhmani for a quick response to the report, but I'm just going to quickly read out her bio. Sukhmani is a senior research, Vice Chancellor, Senior Research Fellow at the Young and Resilient Research Center at Western Sydney University. And she has published extensively on diasporic cultures, multi-platform refugee platforms, and politics of empathy. Sukhmani, to you.
Thank you, Ruchira, and to the Sapna team for such a great and very timely report. I was also very fortunate to be able to peer review it. So I'm just basically going to comment on what I thought of the report and how it links with scholarship in the area, and it's addressing some really important gaps which also link scholarship with activism. I mean, the narratives might suggest that there is exclusion in the movement, but I think the fact that this report has come out of it also suggests that the people who are involved with the school strikes, as well as the people who moved on from the school strikes, are really shaping what the movement looks like in Australia to make it inclusive. So I think that note of their constructive work with it is really important to note. So what I've said in terms of my peer review is that this report is groundbreaking in considering climate justice and climate movements from the point of view of young people of color, specifically those of South Asian descent resident in Australia who participated in the school strikes for climate. And the reason that I say this is novel and timely is because the mainstream environment activist spaces, as Ruchira has pointed out, across the global north, especially here, have been recognized as too white. This is both with regards to who participates in these organized spaces and decision-making roles, who is seen as the face of the movement, and whose agendas are central to middle-class sustainability initiatives. And the lack of connection is both to non-white migrants as well as to people in the global south. Now, the empirical strength of this report lies in its in-depth interviews with 12 former and current school strikers across Sydney and Melbourne. What is most powerful and poignant, for me at least, was that these interviews showed how the life narrative of the young interviewees is interwoven with their climate activism and also with their emergent sense of exclusion. That the researcher was able to build a rapport with the interviewees to elicit such affective responses is testament to the importance of insider perspectives, and also related to that to both decolonizing both research paradigms in the climate justice space. Now, given that there's a relative absence of research about people of color involved in climate justice movements or everyday environmental care in the Australian context, I believe this report will make a vital contribution to this area of scholarship. It is also hoped that it will inspire other researchers, particularly in areas like environmental studies, cultural geography, cultural studies, and other disciplines, to pay more attention to the narratives of non-white, first and second generation migrants who are seldom associated with climate activism. And finally, I'd also like to say that the report makes important recommendations regarding what is required to link climate justice struggles in the global north with those in the global south, where many of the respondents' families are still situated. And I think this link of kinship could be the missing piece in the puzzle, in that it could help build genuine and long-term solidarities between the movements, and ensure that Australia's climate justice issues are globally resonant. That's it for me. From me, thank you, Ruchira.
Thanks a lot, Sukhmani. Often there isn't much crossover between activists and researchers, but we hope to kind of create this kind of forum where both can participate and draw off each other. Thanks a lot for your commentary on the report and your peer review, as yours, Eve. Thank you. I'm going to now pass to Charlie Wood, who needs no introduction, but for many researchers in the room who might not know Charlie Wood, Charlie is the co-founder of Tipping Point and has been a climate organizer for 15 years, helping to build and grow some of Australia's largest community climate networks, including fossil fuel divestment, Stop Adani, and School Strikes for Climate. To you, Charlie.
Thanks so much, Ruchira. And yeah, I just wanted to really emphasize my gratitude for this space and for all the work that's gone into the report, but all the work that you're doing through SAPNA. I think there's a lot of, important honesty and bravery and vulnerability that's being shown. And yeah, also just to express my privilege in being given the opportunity to respond briefly. So yeah, I think sort of given my involvement with the school strike movement, the insights about participation in this movement specifically have been a real source of learning and reflection for me, particularly about when big explosive movements launch onto the scene. And that if we haven't done the deep, thoughtful, relational organizing work to build more inclusive movements before these moments arise, then there's a real risk that the culture of the movement that ensues tries to continue pursuing speed and numerical growth at at expense of the depth of participation, the expense of diversity, and the expense of inclusion, and that these things can't be rushed. So it's really causing me also to reflect more on our goals in building movements, and whether too often when we're thinking about how to scale the climate movement, we're conflating that with size and speed to the detriment of diversity and of depth of relationship. And I guess as a climate organizer, I've often noticed myself kind of seesawing between wanting to go into more depth in smaller spaces where I can build relationality, and then that sort of more spread out global scale when we let ourselves absorb the sheer scale of the climate crisis. And I find I'm more prone to kind of force myself to overstep my limits and do things which feel more commensurate with the scale of the crisis, but in doing so, overlook things, overlook people, overlook difference of perspective, and overlook different lived experience. And so I guess I'm kind of asking myself whether, in pursuit of this desire for rapid movement growth, I'm not just inadvertently sort of replicating the capitalist suppressive systems that are driving climate change. And I was really struck by an Indian activist who works on climate change, sharing with a number of us recently as part of a workshop that SAPNA organized, that he doesn't identify as a climate activist because he feels that identity locates him too sort of far up in the sky. It locates him up in discussions of abstract emissions and numbers, when the impacts of and solutions to climate change are playing out here and now, down on the ground, with people in place and in relational space. And I guess over the last 6 months, I've been collaborating with colleagues on a project to map the climate movement, our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And one of the biggest messages that we've been hearing from folks is that the climate movement still has a long way to go in really embracing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and actually shifting from being a climate action movement to being a truly climate justice focused movement. amazing work already afoot, but a lot more to do. And we've heard that, you know, we still have big gaps in learning and cultivating the kind of relational skills required to build the caring and inclusive cultures that underpin a movement which is focused on climate justice. And so I guess I wonder in this if there's a lesson around what a writer, Pico Iyer, calls the urgency of slowing down, of folks like me doing more of our own inner work, decolonizing ourselves, and particularly of asking folks who are not like me, how would a movement that truly cares for and includes people from diverse walks of life look, how would it function, and how would it feel? Because I guess I'm worried that when we're constantly asking folks to join us, I worry about the kind of neo-colonial undertones to that. You know, who is us? Why should they join us? Are we kind of inadvertently creating an us and them binary in our quest to be growing and responding to the climate crisis with urgency? So I really love this invitation from writer Ijeoma Oluwa, which is, am I listening to people whose identities and experiences are different to mine? Am I looking for what I don't know? And so I guess in that spirit, I feel that my responsibility, at least in contributing to a climate movement that's centered around justice, is to slow down, to take more time to really know and build deep relationships with different groups and communities who are on the front lines of climate change's impacts, and to build in spaciousness to the work, to learn from folks with different experiences to mine, to understand their visions and needs, and to offer my solidarity and support on their terms. And also to accept when I actually have nothing to offer and need to sit in a space of learning and or discomfort. So I guess I want to acknowledge the tension that some of us might feel when we're invited to slow down and work with that greater spaciousness. I feel it in my core because we know that climate change is not slowing down, but I guess I'm not sure that, you know, transforming these long forged systems that brought us climate change can be rushed, nor how a sort of singular focus on emissions reduction won't replicate the same exploitation of people and of landscapes if we don't bring different approaches to bear. So yeah, to my mind, I guess, you know, to close, I see that the climate crisis is really an invitation, and a tragic one at that, to relate differently to one another, to relate differently to ourselves and to the natural world, and that those of us in movements, particularly those of us with privilege, have both the opportunity but also the responsibility to prefigure that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a few reflections. I have so many more, and for this crucially important work that you're all doing. I'm really deeply grateful for it, and I'm constantly learning from SAPNA's work and from so many others who are championing the climate justice work.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for your reflections. They really help to distill and break it down to start the conversations that need to happen in the different networks in the movement. And you kind of know it all, you've seen so much of it. So thank you for these reflections and the honesty that comes with it. So now we're going to move on to South Asian Youth Panel, and you can actually hear from youth activists about their perceptions and their challenges. So I'm going to throw it to you, Varsha, to take over and run the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruchira. And it's just really exciting to see all this come to life because it's been in the works for a while. So yeah, it just feels really good. I don't know how to use Zoom. I'm a boomer, so don't have the background, but I'm a coordinator at SAPNA. I've kind of been here since the start of it and just, you know, being taught by the incredible Jess and Ruchira. So yeah. We have an incredible panel set up. So I'm going to be moderating it, and then the wonderful Shoy, Manjot, and Grace will be part of the panel. So I might just give Manjot, Shoy, and Grace, if all three of you just want to do a speedy little introduction, because I think that people introduce themselves best and, you know, their position and their take on things. So Manjot, if you want to start first and just tell us like a little 30-second, 1-minute summary of yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Manjot. I joined the school strike movement when the first strike happened in Sydney in when November 2018, when I was 17 years old. And now I have spent the last year working on the Stop It Dani campaign, and now the Move Beyond Coal campaign, as well as working on Sapna to create space for these beautiful, diverse stories. And I'm Punjabi, so I'm from the north of India, which is where those massive farmers' protests originated from, if anyone remembers. So quite a political community.
Sure. Do you want to do a little intro?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm Shoy. I am based in Naarm on Wurundjeri country, also called Melbourne, and I joined with the school strike organising in 2020 when I was in year 12, and yeah, have been kind of working in that space for a while. Now working at Tipping Point, also still supporting the school strike network, and doing some organising with Sapna as well.
And last, but certainly not least, Grace, do you want to share?
Sure. Hi, I'm Grace. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm based on Darug country in so-called Western Sydney. I really care about communities and building the power of young people from culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse and climate impacted people, and have the pleasure of doing that through supporting grassroots movements and the People of Colour Climate Network as the climate researcher at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition.
Thank you. So obviously we've got some just incredible humans who've been working so hard in this space. So the way we're going to do this panel is I've got 2 questions, and we're going to start with a negative and then end on a positive kind of future visioning exercise vibe. So we're going to start off with, what have been the main barriers you face? Because you've all kind of started in different areas and have also continued work in slightly different spaces as well. So would love to know the main barriers you face, and like maybe some tips that you feel like would be valuable to people who've experienced that burnout, and what can keep them going. So let's go backwards if that's okay. Grace.
Sure. When I saw the question, what are the main barriers you face as a South Asian in the climate movement, I was like, how long do we have? I've kind of distilled it into 2 kind of themes. One is balancing like your identity and your sense of self with this work. I think I remember when I joined AYCC, it was the week I finished HSC in 2017. I was 17 years old. And I remember walking into this training program and was literally the only South Asian person in this room of like about 80 people. And the world has changed a lot in 5 years. And I think that's been a lot of intentional work, a lot of that done by a lot of the people involved in Sapna now. But I think I remember just like attending this climate science workshop that AYCC was running, and they were talking about like climate refugees and climate displacement. And I remember being like quite shocked that these like white facilitators who were very earnest and like very loving and trying their best, but we're talking about climate displacement as like very far away, very abstract concepts. And I remember sitting there being 17, being like, this has put words to like the experiences of my family and like all of the different like types of desertification, the different types of flooding, the different types of like forced movement within both India and Botswana that my parents and my family have experienced. And I remember like that specific experience kind of thrust me into this world quite unwillingly. And I think I never wanted to do this work. I very much wanted to do like art history or do something fun or travel the world forever. But I think getting thrown into this world of like climate justice and fighting for better representation, better rights, a better future, where our communities are more resilient in the face of something so awful, and learning that quite young is like something that you very much grapple with, of working out who you are as yourself, but also who you are and how you're perceived by a broader movement. And then in that sense also trying to balance out the way that you're still somehow an individual but still representative of every community every time you walk into a room. And so kind of like balancing that was a key challenge I found. The other one was support, whether that was internally from my family, who are very politically conservative, very like Liberal Party-esque people. And I think, yeah, a core aspect was like my parents, when I got really involved in this work, they were really scared that I was going to get arrested by the Australian police and then deported to India, and then Adani would like kill me in India, which is like fair. It happens to like young women in India for sure. But they were really terrified of that and then cancelled my overseas citizenship of India. And like, I think just like that dynamic of like a weird type of support where they're trying to support you, but not actually agreeing with what you believe in or what you're actually fighting for, I think is an interesting like challenge to have when I think the rest of the climate movement kind of expects young people to like have supportive parents or like to have that kind of support. But then that kind of comes into an opposite element of that challenge where you kind of find your family and you find your communities and you fight to build the communities that you need, which is exactly what Sapna is. And so that challenge, like with the internal like aspects of support and having the relationships and the communities that you need to be able to do this work can also be a good thing in that you can find the people that you need to in your life to be able to continue to do this work.
Thank you so much for sharing. Deepa's put in the chat, we're glad you chose climate activism over art history. And yeah, that's speaking for all of us. Thank you. Yeah, it's just so great to hear. And it's tough being a South Asian in this space. And I'm glad it's getting hopefully a little bit easier. Shoy, if you wanted to share some of the main barriers that you face.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like my response was actually exactly the same when I first looked at the question of the sort of, I think it's about like, I've really struggled and still on a journey of identifying as a South Asian activist, because to me it's like South Asian is different to my identity or like experience as an activist. Like they're two different things with two different worlds and like, I guess, lenses of looking at the world. And like, I think that, and maybe this is a little bit different in that like, I think I've struggled to place myself as a South Asian in, even when we're talking about like climate impacts, because like, when I'm operating in the rest of the world in white spaces, like I sort of want to like almost de-racialize myself. Like I'm not really identifying or like bringing my full like, Indian or Bengali self. And I'm like trying not to like, bring that to the front because that's what assimilation is about. And so when I entered School Strike and the climate movement, like I was entering that as a white space that I'm like not bringing sort of my culture or like even like I didn't even have that understanding of like India's history or even like geography and like, those are the things that I haven't spent my life really like learning about or being interested in. And so it's actually been interesting when like now, like I entered, I think at a time where there is a lot more growing interest in these stories and I've been lucky to have like those mentors and examples of South Asian and POC activists who are bringing that perspective in. But like there's like a lot of internal work in the first place to like do the learning and understanding that I have denied myself and sort of white culture has denied us of like learning about ourselves in the first place. To then be able to do the like long work to develop your story and your identity, like, that stuff is like really hard and takes time. So then, similarly, like kind of stepping into spaces and being like, seen as the brown activist, but like, I don't feel like I'm ready to like represent or like tell those stories myself because I haven't had years of experience or space even to identify and like learn those stories in the first place. So yeah, I think it's just like the main barrier is like that journey of bringing together South Asian and activists, because like I feel like a lot of us don't step into the space and aren't allowed to step into the space with any of that automatically.
Yeah, that idea of deracializing is really interesting, and it's something that I know I feel like a lot of us have gone through, because you kind of step out of that completely and you're like, oh, now I'm identifying as South Asian and a climate activist, advocate, whatever. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Manjot, we'll come to you.
Yeah, what have been the main barriers that I've faced? I think like even, yeah, when you asked that question, Basha, I just realized that like that's like an open wound for me. Like I'm sitting here and I'm feeling a lot of hurt because I think the impact of the experiences I had as an activist and being like, because I was South Asian, have like, yeah, for a long time, not only was it really hard in the moment when those experiences were happening, but they really shaped my view of myself and my identity for like years to come, even after I'd left the school strike movement. And even today, when someone asks me a question like this, I feel it really hurts, because I'm like, I feel all the like worthlessness and lack of fitting in and an imposter syndrome that I felt. Yeah, like it's still there and very raw. So I guess I just want to be honest about that this is like, yeah, something that's has ongoing impacts even when you're no longer in that situation. I think some of the main barriers were like this, I felt this massive sense of not like that my story didn't fit in. And I spent a long time when I was speaking at a strike or doing media, trying to like fit into the story of a white activist and my white peers who had these stories of like how they cared about nature and that they were worried for their future in Australia and that they deserved a future, which are valid, completely valid fears, but not why I care about climate change and not what I feel. But there was like no alternative line, like there was no alternative storyline. And there was no space where I could say I care about climate change because of the people who are impacted or because of the heat wave that's in my parents' village. And so for a long time, I was like repeating a story that wasn't mine because I thought it was the only story. And I was feeling very like, yeah, like I didn't belong in that space because my parents weren't amazing activists. And like, I, yeah, didn't have the same connection to nature and didn't camp and like, yeah, didn't have like the right story or the right reasons for caring, but I didn't know how to articulate why I cared. And so I think it took me a long time to learn that my being Punjabi and coming from Punjab and having Indian parents is actually like, yeah, that's actually part of my story, not like something that means I don't fit into the right story. I think I also remember like that even if I wanted to tell that story, there was no room because I might go to like an interview as a school striker and I would have like prepared my story about like, this is what my like is happening in my village right now, or like there's these climate impacts in India, and I would like psych myself up and I was like, okay, like this is why I care, and when they ask me why I care, I'm going to say that. But they'd never ask me any question like that. They'd ask me, do you fly? Do you still fly on planes? Because that's just completely like you're just a hypocrite if you fly and you're doing this stuff. And I was like, yes, I fly to see my grandparents in India, like I'm not jet setting around the world, but unfortunately I do have to catch a plane to see my family. And it's just like this idea that they just assume that every single person, if you're flying somewhere, it's for a holiday because that's what most white Australians use planes for. And I was just like, yeah, there's no room for me to like there's no acknowledgement of any differences or different imperatives for doing this action. I think I completely agree with Choi and Grace's experiences about families. And I remember at the first climate strike, I had to, my parents kept calling me every 15 minutes because they were genuinely worried that I was going to be arrested. It's not like they were like, don't do this because you'll get arrested, as like a way to make me scared and behave better. Like they were genuinely worried and they needed me to pick up the phone. And so it's like, you have to not only, you're trying to do something that you believe in to make the world a better place, but you're doing that hurts your parents and makes them worried. And you have to sit with like managing their emotions, not just managing the climate crisis and the emotions that it makes you feel. And yeah, I think just like, I think that like my experience as a South Asian person, it wasn't even the barriers I faced in terms of like being able to be my full self or participate. It was also the extra work that you have to do that really, really brings you down. Because my experience was that myself and other South Asian strikers and strikers of color were working really, really hard behind the scenes to help pull together these events. And somehow that work was never appreciated, and white strikers who didn't have the same work ethic would be the ones who got a lot of the credit for it. And so you're working really hard, but you don't realize you're working hard. So to the point where when Tipping Point asked if I wanted to work with them, I was really, 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 really confused because I thought I'd done nothing. I was like, why do they want me to work for them? I didn't do anything as a striker, because I had like convinced myself that I had like done nothing of note, or didn't have any skills. And so I like had to sit there being like, I don't understand why they're asking me to come and like help work on their climate campaigns, because obviously I've never ever done anything. So this is really random. I'm gonna pass back to Pasha.
No, thank you so much for sharing that, Madja. And I completely acknowledge like the trauma that literally comes out of this, and that loss. It's not something that goes away once you're like in a position where you're hired and acknowledged for your work. Like it definitely lingers and sticks around. For the sake of time, I'm going to make the last bit super speedy. So I just want one key thing that you would like to see a movement that actually amplifies the voices of South Asians, and obviously accounting for the fact that we're still settlers on this land. But what's one thing that you would like to see the movement change or do to make people like you actually feel like people like us fit in and feel like we belong in the space? Choi, I'm going to start with you. One key thing, quick and snappy, please.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, what's been the strongest and I think has the most potential is like having the spaces for South Asian or other POC communities like and activists with each other, with our mentors, and like our own safe spaces, so that we can get into and like understand those the challenges that we're facing, but also like the positionality that we have within our own communities, like understanding the privileges that I might have as like a Hindu, upper caste Indian person compared to other people in South Asia. Like there's so much to unpack and so much work to do in ourselves and in our communities that we need like our spaces to do that.
Thank you so much. Grace, tell us one key thing.
I think mine is very tangible, of like what Charlie was sort of saying, of like investment in the work to slow down and actually do the deep work and bring communities along, and actually investing and putting the resourcing and the funding behind people in those communities actually leading that work, as opposed to like trying to like force a diversity inclusion model where people are forcing to be integrated into a space, as opposed to actually leading their communities and working and doing that deep relational work to make sure that people are brought along, whether that's their journeys as settlers here or whether that's international stories, and really connecting all of those pieces together.
Thank you, Grace. Manjot, 30 seconds.
Let's like listen to stories of South Asian people, even if it doesn't feel like it's productive. Let's like make space for stories, because they have their own type of productive impact.
Thank you all so much. I feel like I don't have the time to like acknowledge how much adoration I have for all of you. Thank you for sharing that. I will pass back to Ruchira to continue on with this session though. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Varsha, Shoy, Grace, and Manjot. There's nothing like actually hearing first-hand accounts and kind of listening to the panel talk. There's been a tremendous amount of sharing in the chat, so perhaps something to do is sit down with the report with all the POCs who were here today and actually just have more of a sharing exercise. And to everyone else, it's been a listening exercise. We are completely out of time for any burning questions. So I have a suggestion is that some of us, at least I will, stay back at the end of the 2 hours. If anyone has questions and they don't get clarified in the 2 hours, happy to stay back and have further chats if you want to stay. Hopefully some others from Sapna will stay back as well. So this has been, just want to kind of, just to move to a photo shoot for 30 seconds and then take a break. Just before that, just to kind of change the tempo and tie it all together, I want to say that these experiences have been sitting there with them and others for a while, and they have had the chance perhaps to process them or not process them and have moved on and done other things, either in the climate space or not. But this is where experiences and intergenerationality, even in an organization like Sapna matters, is because when I come in as an activist who's been around for a while, and I haven't had the chance to have those conversations on race and representation in the activist spaces I have been in, because I come from a previous time where those conversations don't happen. And these young activists actually are in spaces where those conversations happen, even if maybe in a slightly conflictual way. So people like myself, Jess, Sadia, would look at these conversations and these experiences that young South Asian activists would have had and think, so let's make something of them. And we turn them into recommendations for the climate movement per se. So this session today, the report, the discussions are not about the youth climate activist space entirely. They're about the whole climate movement. Perhaps they're even more about the adult climate movement than they're about youth spaces. There's learnings for everyone. So with that, we're going to pass to Manjot, who's going to take a photo of all of us before people clock off. And after that, we're going to take a 5 minutes break and come back at exactly 12:05. Whoever doesn't want to come back, thank you for coming, and we really enjoyed it.